All right, so here in the second half of our part 2 video, we're talking about the homesteading, the sustainment side of things. 99% of your time, as I've said, is going to be spent, I don't know, not shooting at people trying to kill you, but just trying to grow food, catch water, survive. We're going to go over food. We're going to go over water. We're going to go over how to stay warm, what clothing you should think about, and on all the other miscellaneous things that maybe we miss in our individual chapters, but we kind of recap at the end. That's what this second segment is about. And let's dive in. So next up, it's cool to be able to defend yourself. It's cool to be able to communicate. At some point, you gotta eat.
I'm hungry.
Yeah, I mean, out patrolling and reconning with all the cheap gear we're gonna have on, I'm gonna get hungry. So earlier I talked about systems of sustainment, and that's where I want to talk about with food and water and cooking. Here's the way I view it. Something's going to occur. In the book Patriots, they call it the crunch. In 1 second after it's an EMP, like something's going to occur that's going to shift your thought process on how you're going to start consuming calories. And notice I didn't say food, because that's the new thought process, is what calories do you have? How long can you extend them? There's a lot that you can do to get ready for this, and not all of it is super expensive. I would argue don't go spend $10,000 on MREs, because there's a lot you can do that's going to last just as long and probably be a little bit better for your long-term gut health.
Ask Dirty Civvy about that.
Yeah, Dirty Civvy did a video on eating just freeze-dried food for a month, and he used his bathroom a lot. And so anyways, go check them out. That's an interesting video. The first thing I want to talk about is what most people have a relative abundance of, which is crap in their freezer. If your power hasn't gone out, then this is a little bit less of an immediate, oh my God. But if your power's gone out and there's no immediate look like it's going to get returned, and you don't have a way to plug something in, whether it's generator, solar, things like that, you've got to use those calories before they go bad. Period. The end. I don't care if it's, here kids, eat some ice cream, because, don't tell them this, but it's not going to last very long. But there's other things in your freezer that you might not need to consume immediately, but you need to have a way to preserve them. If you've got, most people have got meat in the freezer, you might have frozen fruits and vegetables. You might have some Jose Ole tacos that are really good that, you got to cook those up and eat those pretty quick. But things that you have in the freezer that are preservable, you want to think about if you have things on hand for that as well. But at the end, first thing to do, eat what's in the freezer if it's not going to stay frozen for very long. Next step after that is obviously your pantry. Canned goods have an expiration date, but they last a whole lot longer than what the expiration date says that they will. Ask me how I know. But your pantry, and in the meantime, you want to be rotating your pantry. So you want to buy things that you commonly eat that have a decent shelf life of a couple of years, put the new ones in the back, rotate to the front. Just eat your normal stuff, but have a little bit extra in there so you buy yourself some time. After that, now we're getting into some of those longer term conversations where the shelf life you want to be a little bit longer. Obviously, freeze-dried foods last up to 25 years if stored correctly. That's the same for some MREs. Some of them have more of a 7 to 8 year shelf life. They taste pretty good, but they're also lacking in quite a bit of different nutrients that you're going to need. Again, Dirty Civvy talks about that in his video. Mike Glover talks about that a little bit on his channel. Your body needs things for digestion, and you need things in your gut to be healthy. And freeze-dried foods don't provide all of that. And I think that's where doing some of your own legwork on long-term food storage comes in. It took me a long time to dive into food-grade buckets with Mylar and some of the oxygen absorbers. That word's hard. But I finally dove in. I just started doing it. That's another video that we're going to do, is just show a very simple process on how to buy flour, rice, oats, different grains or beans that you may want to store long-term. And those things, when stored properly and done correctly, 25-year shelf life. So those are really good ways to get slightly more nutrient food into your diet, as well as canning and doing some other fruit and vegetable preserves. Maybe you don't love pickled things, but obviously that's really good for gut health too. I think really you want to just have an array of different options. But I'll come to this. That system of sustainment thing is have some things that you can cook immediately to buy you a few weeks, if not a month or more. We've talked before, and I know it's grim, but in some of these scenarios, there's going to be an initial die-off. And I don't say that happily. I just say that to suggest you're not going to want to be out and about during that time period, because it's going to be full of violence, crime, panic, different dangerous situations that if you can avoid, you should avoid. So regardless of where you're at, if you're bugging in, you want to have ability to eat for an extended period of time before you start looking at what your other possibilities might be, which is hunting, gardening, depending on where you live, obviously foraging. Side note, depending on where you live, have a book that tells you what you can and can't eat around you. We don't want to have what was that movie? The Wild in Alaska or whatever that one was. We don't want that. So know what your local environment offers you that you can eat safely and then add to your, to your food stores. Water is a whole separate problem on its own. Storing water long-term can be done. Obviously it's heavy and it takes up a lot of space. I would highly recommend you have enough water stored on hand to get you through that same time period of at least probably a month. And if that's some big 350-gallon tanks that got the external cage sitting somewhere in a back shed or garage or even outside covered, it's better than nothing. You may have to retreat it depending on how long it's been sitting, but it's better to have it than to have no water at all that you can't treat because you don't have it. Beyond that, if you live in a place where there's a local source of a spring, lots of you people live where there's lots of water. We live in the desert, so there's not a whole lot. But if you live in places with rivers or, God forbid it rains a lot, catch that.
Mm-hmm.
But that's another thing. You want to have enough to get you through a time period, and then you can set your other systems up on your property or compound to try to collect that rainwater. The last thing to think about on all this is freeze-dried's great, but you got to add boiling water to it to make it actually function. You don't want to eat that stuff plain. I think Peter Griffin did that once on Family Guy, and it didn't go well. But fuels...
Very scientific.
Yeah, I mean, come on, they did their research, I'm sure. But, obviously fuels expend, whether they go bad or whether you run out of them. You need to have other systems in your house for heating water for cooking purposes. If you have a fireplace, that's great, but what's your setup? I mean, you got to be able to boil the water somehow. A wood-burning stove is a cool novelty, which some people definitely still have. You don't have to get a very big one, and you could put that somewhere off to the side in some back corner until you needed it, but you're probably always going to be able to find some sort of burnable material that you could then set the pot on top and boil some water. So do a lot of research on that, figure out what you have locally that you could do. This is a huge topic, but I think with some lists and some planning and some pre-thought, you can have a lot of stuff stored up that doesn't take a ton of space and sets you up really nicely for that first month to 2 months, depending. What's your thoughts on some of that?
All correct. And by no means are we hitting all the points here. This is a hole that we could start digging and we would end up in China, literally, before we filled it as far as with information. So again, water. Know your local area. Do you have access to running water as far as streams, springs, things along those lines? If you're near the coast, there are means of getting fresh water out of seawater. Just make sure you do that right, or else that's a pretty big negative. So the other thing is to talk about would be, restoring power or maintaining power at your compound, your home, whatever it is. I've got a generator that can wire into my house. It works fine, but that generator runs on propane or gasoline, which is only going to be able to be stored for so long. Let me recant real quick. Propane, on the instance, propane can pretty much last indefinitely. The problem is having it. How much do you got?
Yeah.
That's going to be a big deal. And then the container that it sits in. Is the container going to, fail, rust, this and that? Now, obviously, that could be a long time down the road. But all of the problems with storing fuel to run said generators or kerosene for heat is all going to be how much can you store? And that becomes a whole different problem. Now, diesel and gasoline, which are going to be our two main fuels for the most part with a lot of these things, unfortunately have a shelf life. And that shelf life, for diesel, we're looking at, optimistically 2, maybe 3 years. Maybe you can squeeze some more out of there with just the perfect conditions and treating it with the right additives. And the same with gasoline. Gasoline, upwards of potentially 4 years if stored and treated properly. You still may be able to get some uses out of it when it really starts to, kind of fall apart. Yeah. But obviously it's not going to pack as much punch. Kerosene, as far as cooking and heating, that's going to last the longest. I think we got probably 5+ years potentially, as far as that one goes. But again, hard to store a lot of it. It's a liquid. When you got a tank in the ground out back, like, what was it in Patriots? You had a ground storage for the diesel. Yep. Those are they're great ideas, not feasible for the majority of people. Mm-hmm. The other argument would be some form of solar generator or solar battery block that's going to charge. Some of the technology's come a really long way recently, and that could be a lifesaver. Now, long-term use of those things, I don't know that they've been out enough to really prove themselves. Like anything, things can be made to work, but last forever is a different story. So yeah. Mm-hmm.
The only other thought process on generators is obviously we talk about noise signature and not wanting to pronounce yourself. The great thing about solar is you can set a panel up, hook it into one of those battery banks or a power
Probably
cube or something like that.
Cooling fans running, so to speak.
Yeah.
Minimal noise.
Yeah. Whereas a generator, if you're going to have that and you've got long-term fuel for it, you want a system where you can run it in your garage, vented properly, so you're not going to have a lot of sound signature outside of your home. nothing screams, come and attack me more than having lights on, power, and
all the amenities you have that someone else doesn't.
Watching your favorite film in the middle of an actual apocalypse because you have a generator and you're just running it willy-nilly. So be cognizant of sound signatures and other concerns. And even if you have power, you may not want to use a lot at night because you want to reduce any signature you have. I do know you can put solar on the roof of your home and you can run that down to at least a singular plug or 2 plugs off of an inverter. So even if you don't have access to a generator or you don't want to deal with long-term fuel storage.
Or if you have battery packs on your house for solar.
Yeah, that's true too. Obviously, if you have one of those battery walls. There's some really cool recent ways, as you said, to have some more power that you can be done silently. My opinion, have both, because you're going to want both at some point. And I think there'll be a time and place where you can use a generator without selling out, your location or what you have.
Yeah, and I mean, and again, just real quick touch base, kind of recap also. I mean, and if you're new to this and you're storing things, obviously food supply and water has got to be number one. I mean, you do need protection. You got to have a way of, protecting yourself and whatnot. But again, initial phase of this whole thing potentially happening, you got to have water and food.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. And another thing, talking about things you don't have enough of. Even if you're catching water, you need to be able to either treat it or filter it. Boiling is always an option, but that requires fuel, whether that's wood or gas or anything else. So I think having a lot of different ways to filter your water, treat your water. If you're next to a running stream, that's great. Probably still going to want to filter it out if possible. So just another thing to think about that we didn't mention in the water section, but obviously is really important to have a lot of it on hand.
A couple categories that are easily overlooked would be medical and personal hygiene. Personal hygiene, we take it for granted. We have this perfect world that we're living in for the most part. Most of us, as far as running water, hot water, things like that. We get up in the morning, we run in to take a shower, we scrub ourselves, clean ourselves, brush our teeth, and kind of go on about our day. How prepared are you going to be? We have a rationed amount of water where we can't just sit here and take a 30-minute shower with hot water blowing all over us. So things like that to think about. So personal hygiene is going to be big. Potentially, giving yourself a sponge bath almost. Take a clean rag, wipe yourself down. But you don't want to overlook it. You don't want bacteria, and infections growing in any kind of weird place along those lines. The other thing would be teeth. I think really got to focus on teeth. Brushing your teeth, stock up on toothpaste. I don't really overly know what the shelf life is on toothpaste, but I'm going to continue to use it until the tube is empty, and then I'm going to continue to just brush, regularly. Teeth are so important. Anybody that's had to go to the dentist for a cavity, that is an excruciating pain that you don't want to deal with, especially in a post-apocalyptic situation. And we certainly don't want to sit here and be like Castaway, using rudimentary tools to remove a tooth. That would be horrible. So, stocking up on floss. You could stock up on almost a mile of floss, and just, things like that. They're not going to take up a lot of space. Stock up on tons of toothbrushes, things like that. Again, toothpaste. Those are kind of points there. What did that look like for you, Jared?
So I came up with this weird little thing, but it's like neither of us are females, as you can see, but obviously if you have ladies in your group or ladies are watching this, there's a whole other category of hygiene that needs to be taken into consideration. One of the things I just kind of joked about was tamps, teeth, and toenails. You got to be able to clip your toenails and your fingernails, take care of some of your own basic personal hygiene, things like that. Shifting over into the medical side of things, everyone, and rightfully so, people, tourniquets and IFAKs and some of these crazy medical kits for, again, if you do get shot or you're out using an axe, splitting wood, and you cut yourself wide open, or a chainsaw. There's a lot that can go wrong. There's even a lot that can go wrong if you just cut yourself on a rock, and it's not a big cut, and in modern times it wouldn't be a big deal, but if you don't treat it correctly, it can get infected, and you can have some serious issues. So acute treatment is really important. You need to have all those things for major issues, but I think some of the things that get left in the weeds a little bit are some of those basic first aid supplies that you need, antiseptics and Band-Aids and gauze and wraps and splints, all these different components that you might need occasionally, but right now we can survive because we have that running water that you talked about. In the future, you may not, and you have different ways you have to deal with that. Again, a system of sustainment for me is all of these things up front, but finding ways to, so for example, antiseptic, like you can make soap, but do you know how to make soap? I currently don't know how to make soap. But even in just going through these videos and this process, it makes me want to think like, okay, I need to get the materials together to do something like that. On the toothpaste side of things, what is it? Baking soda and water, I think you could use. Just as it ain't going to taste good, but it's better than just scrubbing. Are you someone that has a chronic illness, or someone in your group have a chronic illness that is currently medicated, or just something to be aware of? Those are things that you should think about. Won't go down the rabbit hole of antibiotics in terms of you could get them from the vet, maybe you can get them from across the border, but I think those are good things to think about as well. Knowledge is power. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but the second best time is right now. I have a number of books that I've purchased over the years that I've skimmed through, but I can't say that I know all of them really, really well. Where There Is No Doctor is a good one. Where There Is No Dentist is a good one. It's The Ultimate Medical Survival Guide is another really good one that's really thick. And that gives you tons of ideas of supplies you could buy and how to do some procedures. All of those books would be a great resource to have with you. In your downtime of gardening and not fending off the hordes of zombies, you might do some light reading on how to repair, a puncture wound.
Mm-hmm.
This whole category isn't as fun or sexy as some of the other things that we've talked about, but clearly probably one of the most important, because even a little issue can become a major issue if you don't have the right knowledge and gear to be prepared for it.
Absolutely. And just one thing that crossed my mind is just thinking about tetanus. And I know this recently, I did not contract lockjaw or anything, but I was unaware. We always think of rusty nails. We think of metal. When I was at the hospital for a fairly large wound I had a couple years ago, I was told that actually tetanus is actually contracted more out of just dirt, out of the ground. It's basically, whether it be the iron and different minerals in the ground. I mean, so if you take a spill hard enough in the dirt and tear yourself open, they're concerned. Road rash, things like that. Again, I was always under the auspicion. It was, more of
from rusty metal.
More of rusty metal, but something to think about it. Are you up on your tetanus shot? And I say that, I know they're good for years, but gosh, never had a tetanus shot, and then you go into this situation. That's
gonna be tough to eat with lockjaw.
Oh, yeah.
Final thought here, I think, is A, it's useful, and B, it's tradable, would be alcohol. Whether that's you want to have something that's north of 50% so that it actually has some antiseptic qualities. Obviously, it's tradable. The negative side to alcohol is what it does to people, so being cognizant of that. But I mean, I think it's a really good way to disinfect wounds, and then also in small quantities you could trade it off to other people. What they do with it, that's on them, but as long as they're going to be far enough away from your encampment, hopefully they don't become a problem.
Another thing to be thinking about would be just seasonal comfort, right? We get used to walking around with a nice, comfortable 72 degrees in our house 24/7. That's not going to be the case anymore if things like this do happen, especially a grid going down and God knows what. Things to think about. Do you have a fireplace in your house? Obviously, burning wood burning stove. You touched base on that before. Those are all going to be heat sources that are going to help keep you more comfortable, along those lines. Also, proper clothing. I mean, you live in an area, you know what the environment is. You know what winter feels like. You know what summer feels like. Have a proper attire for all kind of occasions. But don't overlook potentially, make sure you got gloves. Make sure you got warm gloves. Make sure you got potentially just work gloves. Extra socks. Potentially underwear. One thing to even think about, which I didn't even think about until Jared brought it up, potentially smaller clothing, just a couple pairs. If you are being serious about it, you're probably going to lose weight. You're not going to be eating the McDonald's anymore and finally get that Ozempic body you've been looking for. Yeah. So things like that. And I would also say, potentially, especially in the wintertime, get used to being more uncomfortable. And the same with the summertime, depending on where you're located. Summers get pretty hot. I do think it's probably easier to fend off the heat than it is the cold, depending. But definitely things to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. You can only take off so much. I think cold weather time, you're looking at layering for sure. If you have a fireplace in your home and you're going to use it for warmth, you're going to want to probably close off some exterior rooms. Everyone gets to have spend the night in the living room kind of a situation. I think we've done this before. You can use blankets. Like we've gone camping in an RV before where it's just really cold outside. So you're hanging a blanket by the door to help create some more insulation. You can use plastic on your windows to create insulation. I think there's a lot that you can do to help mitigate. But at the end of the day, you're going to be sleeping in a lot of layers, and you're going to be hopefully, huddling for warmth, whether you like it or not. And that's where that hygiene piece comes back. And you want to smell a little bit decent if you're huddling for warmth. A couple other things. We talk about some of the clothing that you're going to buy. I think there's a conversation about quantity over quality, right? Or quality over quantity, excuse me. You can go buy a trash bag full of really cheap socks from Walmart or wherever, or you can spend that same amount of money on 20 pairs of really quality socks. And 20 pairs might seem like a lot, but You're working every day, you're wearing them every day, you're probably in boots most days in these types of scenarios. And you want to have quality socks, in my opinion. Another thing too, though, is some of these things other people may not have, and it's a trade item. It becomes a bartering item, whether that's pants, socks. I think shoes are going to be a really big one that you could barter with other people. Size depending, of course. So as mentioned earlier, I've got 3 little kids. They're not always going to be in the sizes that they're currently at, and the oldest one, I don't have anything for them, right? So those are all things that you have to think about. Again, if this ends up being a 6-month scenario, not as big of a deal. If it ends up being a 5-year scenario, that's a huge deal. And those are things that they're more periphery. They're not an immediate, but at the same time, if you have the time and you have the planning to go through and procure those things, absolutely do it. Why not? The shelf life on a pair of socks is probably more or less eternal as long as you store it correctly. So I think that just kind of is me covering a few different things. The last thing, I can't help myself, you know what I'm going to talk about next, is footwear. I have to talk about footwear. I think there's a couple different schools of thought on this. I think buy once, cry once when it comes to boots is definitely a true statement. Buy quality boots that fit where you're at in your environment. We live in the high desert. We have 4 distinct seasons. We have some wet time. We have some seriously dry, hot time. We have some cold time. I'm a huge proponent of Victo's boots. They're not the only boots that are good. There's lots of boots out there that are good, but I have a rotation of the Johnny Combats, the regular ones, which are not waterproof, but they breathe really nicely. Johnny Combat waterproofs, which obviously, as the name intends, are waterproofs. They don't breathe as well, but there's a time and place for that. And then their winter boots, we've talked about it before on a previous video, but holy crap, those things worked really, really well.
They were impressive.
Yeah.
I've worn Sorels, different things in a lot of heavy snow, and I've lived in some really cold areas of the country. And we ended up getting a truck stuck, and we took a hike for a couple miles and probably close to 2 feet of snow. And I will say, after the hike, I didn't even notice my feet. Now, everything's got time, and eventually it would soak in, but I was impressed for the price point and quality of those boots. Absolutely.
Yeah, and so you think about a rotation of your boots. I have gotten multiple years out of the ones that I just mentioned because I wear them at certain times of the year. That's just my process on it. You might have a different thought process on footwear and boots and what you would have based on your location. By the way, we're not sponsored by Victos. Most of their gear I think is pretty great. Some of the things, not so much.
Yeah.
But the shoes I think we've been really, really impressed with. And I wanted to take a step aside and just bring those up because I think they're really worth the investment. So rounding out that conversation, obviously you know best where you live, what your needs are going to be, what your seasons look like. If you're sitting on the coast of San Diego right now, you're just laughing about all of this. But most of the rest of the country has to think about these particular components. So, dress accordingly.
Absolutely. Last but not least, things that we potentially missed, miscellaneous, things along those lines. A lot of things that come to my mind are just basic things that we have around the house. Are we using firewood to keep ourselves warm potentially in the winter? Do you have an axe? Do you have a chainsaw? Chainsaw requires fuel. Chainsaw creates tons of noise. Those are things to think about. Maybe basic construction tools, hammer, screwdrivers, nails, screws, things like that. Basic repairs around potentially the compound or just your house. Another thing would be cordless tools, battery operated tools. They're going to be a huge benefit. However, if you don't have means of charging them at some point, they're going to be completely useless, just dead weight at that point. Possibly even some fuses. I mean, whether it be for your automobile, if that's still being utilized, or any kind of, gasoline powered devices. A lot of them have some form of fuse in some cases. Some things to think about there. And obviously some of that can go down to kind of what do you have and potentially having some stuff prepared for, a mindset around your circle as far as things that keep an eye on.
Yeah. I think you don't have enough. And that's not to say like go make poor financial decisions. It's not a scare tactic, but I just think depending on what you're preparing for, you just don't have enough. But having something's better than nothing, right? And a lot of the things you just talked about take up space. So depending on your situation, you might have a shed that you can store some of this stuff in and your garage is packed full like most of America's garages are. If you got more space and more storage, great, utilize it. I try to think through, all right, what are some of the random things that we maybe touched on or didn't talk about at all? I think you don't have enough toilet paper. COVID was this weird thing.
I think the pandemic told us that.
Yeah, you just don't have enough toilet paper. Obviously, TP, if not stored right, is going to fall apart eventually, whether that's from moisture or just drying out. I think paper towels would be a really overlooked thing that they take up quite a bit of space, admittedly, but having those, you can have regular towels, but if you don't have water or means of washing them, that's going to be a problem too. And you can save dirty paper towels and use them for kindling. That's another thing. You have lots of newspaper stored up and things like that. every little thing that you think of ahead of time is going to make your life easier when that situation comes, and it's going to buy you time to, again, build your process on your property. We didn't talk at all about sewing, but I think having some sewing kit and some sewing knowledge would be really, really intelligent, again, if we're trying to keep clothes in workable order for a longer period of time. What are your long-term skills? Do you have a long-term skill that you could develop for trade purposes or just for your own purposes? I talked earlier about different types of alcohol. I mean, theoretically, you could build a distillery. I don't know what state laws say about that, but
state laws don't matter in this conversation.
Yeah, I was going to say, at this point, you go out and buy it, maybe teach yourself how to do it. But, and I don't mean for drinking purposes, but obviously alcohol at a high enough percentage has a lot of functionality for trade or for other things. Can you can food? Do you have enough supplies that you could do long-term canning of things that you gather or trade for? Soap, again, I talked about soap. I won't harp on it again, but having the ability to make it, I think, would be really important. And then one thing that I think is really, truly overlooked is entertainment. I said earlier, 99% of your time is going to be downtime where you're just surviving in whatever your process looks like with the people that you've chosen to try to make it with. But if you have power sources and they're renewable, you could have DVDs or you could have, videos recorded onto a hard drive. If you don't have that, there's obviously board games, there's card games, books, magazines. All those things take up space, but if you have magazines about, farm and country, or Recoil has a magazine called Off Grid that's full of really good ideas. Having a library of fun reading and then also really practical reading in these scenarios, I think, is going to be really important.
Absolutely. And one other thing to touch base on that I don't think we touched anywhere here, just a thought. We're all human beings and we have urges and desires. Contraceptives.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the last thing you want to be doing is potentially bringing something into this world and having to deal with that, and then potential medical needs on top of that. Now, granted, we've been, as human beings, been birthing, no, not us, but human beings and females have been birthing children for thousands of years successfully without all the medical advantages we have. But that's a huge thing to think of.
Yep.
Absolutely. So.
We tried to cover everything, not too much depth on any one piece. I think, again, if you're new to this genre, I think we probably have put out some good thoughts for you to go through and apply them to your particular situation. And if you've been thinking about this or doing this for a really long time, I would love to hear what your feedback is on some of the things we talked about or didn't talk about in the comments. Let us know. I know we're, as we've said before, not experts, but we've thought about this quite a bit and hope that it never happens, and at the same time would be foolish not to prepare for the worst outcomes possible. So, but with that said, thanks for joining us on part 2 of this series. As always, like and subscribe, and we'll see you guys next time.